Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Microsoft Office 365 for Enterprises Summit. For today's event, the hardworking staff at Redmond Magazine has organized sessions featuring two independent experts, Brian Posey and Nathan O'Brien, and an information-packed session featuring presentations by our sponsors, KOsoft, AvePoint, Metallic, Druva, and BitTitan. Thanks for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of Application Development Trends, and I'll be your moderator for the first of three sessions that I'm sure will be, if nothing else, mighty illuminating. But before we get underway, I need to go over a few housekeeping details. Each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording coming your way within the next few days. Each of today's sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you throughout the summit. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Our sponsors have provided some additional resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a minute to check those out. And finally, at the end of the third session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a Nintendo Switch. Part console, part handheld, it's the only gaming device you need, but you must be present to win, so stick with us. Now let's get started with our first session, Best Practices for Implementing, Managing, and Optimizing Office 365 and Microsoft 365. Our presenter, Microsoft MVP Brian Posey, is a scientist, a best-selling author, a sought-after speaker, and an honest-to-God commercial astronaut in training. Throughout his career, Brian has written and contributed to dozens of IT books, created numerous full-length video training courses, and published thousands of blog posts on a huge variety of IT and space-related topics. I've read many of Brian's posts, but by far my favorite is a series he's writing for Redmond Magazine about his commercial space flight training. It's called Posey's Moonshot, and it is a must-read. We're lucky to have you today, Brian. Take it away.
Hey, thank you so much for that introduction. So today I want to talk about implementing and managing Microsoft 365. And there's going to be a very heavy emphasis on the implementation part, especially as it relates to the enterprise. Because there's been such a vast amount of information published on the implementation process. And to be quite honest with you, a lot of that information is contradictory in nature, or it's way more complicated than it needs to be. So what I really want to do is break it down, show you how this works from square one, and show you some of my own favorite best practices and techniques that I like to use. So when we're talking about Microsoft 365 implementation and optimization, there are really two different angles that we have to look at this at. Infrastructure, I'm talking about things like server applications such as Exchange and SharePoint and that sort of thing, as well as Azure AD. And then there's also the desktop and mobile side, the Office apps, things like Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, the apps that we all use every day. So I'm going to be talking about both of these. Now, one thing I quickly want to mention before I really get into this is that I've got good news and I've got bad news. The bad news is that this is a really heavy presentation. There are, and I kid you not, nearly 80 slides. Now, for those of you who are already thinking death by PowerPoint, there is some good news. The good news is that there's very, very little text within this presentation. I think I've got maybe 4 or 5 slides that have text out of 80. The rest of it is all screen captures. So essentially what this is going to be is a presentation that is almost entirely demo. Obviously, I can't do a live demo in this environment, so the screen captures are the next best thing. I can show you exactly how this process works and the best practices that I like to use. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into it. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the initial Microsoft 365 setup process. So I'm just going to begin from square one, so that way we're all on the same page. So when you set up a Microsoft 365 subscription from scratch, you go through the Let's Get You Started screen, the Tell Us About Yourself screen, and then you arrive at the screen right here, how you'll sign in. And when you get to the screen, you're prompted to enter a domain. Now, this isn't the same domain name that you use internally, because whatever you enter here is going to be appended to on Microsoft.com. So think of it more as a subdomain. Now, in the slides that I'm going to be using throughout this presentation, I'm going to be using a custom domain name called PoseyLabs.com. Now, because of something that I did once in the past, I couldn't use PoseyLabs.com on this screen. Typically, that's what you would want to do, is just use a name that matches the domain name that you're already using. In this case, it was impossible, so I just picked another name out of thin air. I used Posey Office on Microsoft Office365.com. Now, in a way, this isn't really important because we're going to switch over to a custom domain name later on, but you are going to want to make note of the domain name that you initially set up because there are times throughout the experience when you'll have to refer back to that. So with that said, once you enter your domain name right here, the next thing you'll do is click Next in true Microsoft fashion, and then you'll get taken to this confirmation details screen. It's going to confirm your administrative user account and the email address that you've used to register your Microsoft 365 subscription. It's a good idea to make note of both of those because these are things that you'll probably end up needing later on. So from there, you would click Get Started, and then you'll get taken to this wizard that walks you through the initial configuration process. Now, the very first screen that you'll see is the one right here that prompts you to install Office. This is the Office applications, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, OneNote, Outlook, and what have you. What I would recommend on the screen is to just not do anything at all. Just click Next, which the Next button is cut off on the slide, but just click Next to skip the Office installation. Now, the reason why I say this is because we're talking about enterprise environments, and in the enterprises, we all know everything has to be scalable. So you really don't want to be installing Office manually if you can get around doing that. And later on in this presentation, toward the end, I'm going to show you a technique for automating the deployment process of the Office applications, even if you don't necessarily have an application management tool. So definitely be sure and stick around for that. But for right now, go ahead and skip the Office installation. And then the next question that you're going to be asked is, does your office or does your organization have a domain? This is where your real domain name comes into play. And as you may recall, a moment ago I mentioned that the domain name that I was going to be using throughout this presentation was posylabs.com. And so this is where that gets entered. So then the next thing that you have to do is to verify that you actually own the domain. This is Microsoft's way of preventing domain name hijacking. So there are a few different ways that you can prove ownership of the domain. Probably the most common option is to simply add a text record to your DNS. And then once you've done that, Microsoft will go back and verify the addition of that text record, and assuming that it finds that text record within your DNS, then it will assume that, yes, you do indeed own that domain name or at least have control over it. And then it's okay for Microsoft to go ahead and use that for your Microsoft 365 account. Another option is to add an MX record. MX records, if you're not familiar with those, are the records that are used for email. And then there's even an option to just add a file to your website. That is also another way that you can prove domain ownership. Now, depending on where your domain is registered, there may sometimes be a fourth option. That fourth option, you don't get it every time, but the fourth option is to simply sign in to your domain provider, and then you'll click a register button once you've done that, and then you don't have to worry about altering DNS records or anything of that sort. So as you can see on this slide, the very first option is sign into GoDaddy, and it says recommended, and that's because this particular domain name is registered with GoDaddy. So assuming that you go ahead and do the text-based registration option, what you would have to do is create a text record on your DNS server that matches the text record that Microsoft provides you. The way that I tend to think of this is being similar to the verification codes that Microsoft and other software providers will sometimes send to your cell phone to prove that you have ownership of an account. This is essentially the same thing, except that Microsoft is giving you a piece of information, telling you to stick that information in your DNS server, and then once you've done that, they verified that you were able to do that, and then that proves domain ownership. So in this case, it's just a TXT record, and they give you a value to stick in there, and then you go back and you do that on your DNS server, and Microsoft checks for it. So what does that look like? Well, the experience varies widely depending on who your domain registrar is. In the case of GoDaddy, it looks a lot like the screen right here. So as you can see at the bottom of the slide, I've set the type to TXT, I've set the host to the @ symbol, and then I've set the text value to that value that Microsoft gave me. Now, in case you're wondering what this looks like in another environment, I also walked through the same basic thing on a register.com domain just so that you could see what it looks like. And you can see that all of the same basic elements are still here. It's just the way that the formatting is done is a little bit different. But the basic procedure is roughly the same. So once you've gone through the domain verification process, the next step is to add user accounts. This is another one of those processes that I really recommend just skipping for right now because, again, we're working in an enterprise environment, and you've probably got a large number of users. At the very least, hundreds, probably more like thousands or even more. And you really don't want to use a screen like this to start creating user accounts. Besides, assuming that you've already got an on-premises environment that already has those user accounts, you can actually cause problems by creating duplicate accounts right here. So I would recommend skipping this process. But the one thing that I do want to point out on this screen is that it verifies what type of subscription you've got. In this case, I've got an Office 365 E3 subscription, and it shows you how many licenses you've got. Now, you'll notice in this case, I've got 25 licenses, and it's showing 24 remaining. And the reason why you only have 24 out of your 25 licenses is because in the very beginning, when we created the account and we set up that administrative account, remember the Brian at poseyoffice.onmicrosoft.com account? That's treated as the administrative account for this, so it's automatically assigned a license. So that's where that missing license went to. So skip the user creation process at this point, and then you'll be taken to a screen that asks, how do you want to connect your domain? What this really refers to is that there are some DNS records that have to be created in order for the various Microsoft 365 server applications, Teams, Exchange, SharePoint, and that sort of thing, in order for those to work properly. So what the screen's really asking you is how you want to handle the creation of those DNS records. The easiest thing to do is to choose the option to let Microsoft add your DNS records. And what you would do if you select that is to simply choose the option, and then you're taken to a screen that allows you to sign in. You sign into your domain registrar, and then Microsoft automatically adds the DNS records. Another option is to add your own DNS records, in which you would simply create the DNS records manually. And then there's also an option to go ahead and skip this for right now and do it later. I don't recommend skipping this because, as I mentioned a moment ago, the various Microsoft 365 applications won't work correctly until these records are created. So this is something that you're going to want to go ahead and do up front. Now, if you do decide to create DNS records manually, there are a few different options. One option is to download a CSV file that has those DNS records pre-populated in it, and then you can import that into your DNS. There's also an option to download a zone file, which can be imported into some DNS servers. And then if I were to scroll down on the screen, Microsoft also prints out what the DNS records need to be, so you can copy those down and then manually enter those into your DNS server. So you have a variety of different ways that you can accomplish this. So then once you get past the addition of the DNS records, you're taken to the screen right here, help people use Microsoft Teams, and there's nothing that you have to do on the screen. This is basically just an advertisement. So you would click Next, and then you're taken to a screen saying Setup is complete. So at that point, you can move forward with configuring Microsoft 365 to suit your organization's needs, and this is where things get a lot more interesting. So what do you do after Setup completes? Well, there are any number of post-configuration tasks that you can get into. I'm going to illustrate the ones that I view as being the most important. There are several others that come to mind, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to be able to cover all of them. After all, entire books have been written about this sort of thing. So the very first thing that I recommend doing is going back and just double-checking your domain. As you'll recall, we had two domain names that were associated with this particular Microsoft 365 account. We had poseyoffice.onmicrosoft.com, and we also had poseylabs.com. Now, poseylabs.com is our custom domain name. That's the primary domain name that's used by the organization. And so that's the one that we want Microsoft 365 to treat as the default. And typically, it will automatically be the default, but it is important to go in and check because over the years, I've seen probably one or two situations in which, for whatever reason, the custom domain name was treated as secondary rather than as the default. And that can cause problems later on. So I recommend just taking a couple of minutes right off the bat and just making sure that Microsoft 365 is using the correct domain name as the default. And the way that you get to that is by opening the Microsoft 365 Admin Center and then going into Settings, clicking Domains, and then you'll be taken to the screen right here, and you can clearly see which one of those domain names is the default. The next thing that I recommend doing is verifying the storage limits that are associated with your Microsoft 365 account. And this is one of those things that is actually a little bit tedious to do, and this is where those few text-based slides that I mentioned earlier come into play. And the reason is because the amount of storage that Microsoft gives you varies widely depending on what type of account that you've got. So I'm going to go over storage at a very high level just to kind of give you a sense of what your limits might be, but it's very important to go in and verify how much storage you actually have available, because it's difficult to plan for how your organization will actually use Microsoft 365 if you don't know exactly how much storage is available to you, because you really don't want to be suddenly running out of cloud storage one day and not know what to do about it. So let's talk about Exchange first. Now, with Exchange, there are several different types of data that are stored in Exchange, but the one that tends to take up the most space is mailbox data. Now, in the case of an Enterprise E1 subscription, you get a 50 gigabyte limit for each mailbox, and then there's also an archive mailbox, and that archive mailbox also has a 50 gigabyte limit. Now, if you've got an Enterprise E3 or E5 account, then the mailbox limit is 100 gigabytes, and there's an unlimited amount of space available in the archive mailboxes. The caveat to that, however, is that the archive mailboxes are initially set to 100 gigabytes in size, and there's an option, I believe it's called automatically expanding, that you have to enable in order to get that unlimited storage. Now, there are completely separate limits that apply for things like address books, resource mailboxes, shared mailboxes, and all the other types of data that Exchange deals with. So I've provided a link to a website at the bottom of this slide that details what all of those storage limits are for the various types of Microsoft 365 subscriptions. And I would encourage you to download this presentation later on and go out and visit that link and just see what those limits are for your own organization. Now, in the case of SharePoint, things are a little bit simpler, but they're also a little bit deceptive. So in the case of an Enterprise E1, E3, or E5 subscription, you can have up to 2 million SharePoint sites, or site collections as they used to be called. And each one of those sites has a 25 terabyte limit. Now, just because there's a 25 terabyte limit for each one of 2 million sites doesn't mean that you get millions and millions of terabytes available to you. Actually, you only get 1 terabyte, and that 1 terabyte of space has to be shared among all of your SharePoint sites. Now, you do get a little bit of extra space based on your user count. For every licensed user, license being the key word, you get an extra 10 gigabytes of space. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but if you've got thousands of users and you get an extra 10 gigabytes for each one of them, that can be a considerable amount of space. But if your organization uses SharePoint heavily, there's a good chance you're probably going to have to invest in additional storage space. Again, Microsoft publishes a website where they outline all of these space limitations for SharePoint, and there's a link at the bottom of the slide. Now, in the case of OneDrive, things are a little bit simpler. For an Enterprise E1, E3, or E5 subscription, you get 1 terabyte of space per user, and as long as you've got at least 5 licensed users, you can go in and you can set that threshold to as high as 5 terabytes per user. So now let's move on and talk about Azure AD Connect. Now, Azure AD Connect isn't a part of Microsoft 365, but if you've got a hybrid environment, in other words, if you've got an on-premises environment and you've got a Microsoft 365 environment and you want to establish Active Directory synchronization between the two, then this is something that you're going to need. So you can download Azure AD Connect for free from Microsoft using the link at the bottom of the slide, and you'll need to set that up on a virtual machine or even a physical machine in your own organization. Now, one thing that I'll quickly want to mention about Azure AD Connect is that it contains a lot of very sensitive information once you get it set up. So Microsoft recommends that you secure Azure AD Connect in a manner similar to what you would use to harden a domain controller. So you're going to want to treat this as a very sensitive resource. So Microsoft has made a few changes to Azure AD Connect since the beginning. The biggest change that tends to impact people is that the current version of Azure AD Connect requires TLS version 1.2. And for whatever reason, TLS 1.2 isn't enabled by default in Windows Server. So if you download Azure AD Connect and you attempt to install it in the usual way, you're going to get an error message like this one. So this raises the question of how do you enable the required version of TLS? Well, the official way of doing it is to go in and modify a whole bunch of registry keys. Now, obviously, that's a tedious and potentially error-prone process. So I would advise against that. What I would recommend doing is going to the website that's displayed at the bottom of this slide. And when you go to this website, there's a PowerShell script that's displayed on the site. And you can copy that code, which you can also see on the slide. You can copy that into Notepad, save the file with a .ps1 extension, and then run that as a PowerShell script. And when you do that, that's going to go ahead and enable TLS 1.2. And then you can move forward with installing Azure AD Connect. So let's take a look at the process. Once you've got TLS 1.2 installed, then go ahead and launch the Azure AD Connect Setup Wizard, and you'll be taken to a screen like this. Nothing you really have to do here aside from accepting the license agreement and clicking Continue. Then you'll be taken to a screen that asks you if you want to use Express settings or perform a custom setup. In the vast majority of cases, you're probably going to be able to get away with using Express settings. And even if you find out later on that Express settings probably weren't the right choice, you can go in and make some modifications to Azure AD Connect. So if you choose the Express settings option, you're going to be taken to this screen right here that prompts you for a set of administrative credentials for your Azure AD account. Now remember, this is the copy of Azure AD that is included with Microsoft 365. If you've got a separate Azure account somewhere, that's not what we're talking about. So this is going to be an account that has full-blown administrative privileges in your Microsoft 365 environment. Once you've entered that, you click Next, you come to a screen that asks you to do the same thing, but for your on-premises Active Directory environment. Now, one thing that I want to be sure and point out on this slide is that right now, this is set to my domain admin account, and that's okay because this is just a lab environment. But in a production environment, I would very strongly recommend creating dedicated accounts both on the Azure AD side and in the Active Directory side, just for auditing purposes, because that way, if you ever have a security breach or an account is compromised, you can find out which account it was a lot more easily. Not to mention you limit the blast radius, or limit the amount of damage that can be done by a compromised account if you're using different accounts for different purposes. So use dedicated accounts for Azure AD Connect. So once you've entered that, click Next. You come to the You're Ready to Configure screen. Take a second and make sure that the Start the Synchronization Process when the configuration completes checkbox is selected, which it should be by default, and then click Install. And after several minutes, you'll be taken to a screen like this saying that the configuration is complete. So it's that easy to get this up and running. Now, it can take a bit of time for your Active Directory to synchronize to Azure AD, especially if you've got a large directory. But in the meantime, there is something that you need to do, and that is to give a bit of attention to passwords. Now, why is this so important? Well, you have to look at the way that Microsoft originally intended Azure AD Connect to be used. Back when Azure AD Connect first came out, I think that it's probably safe to say that Microsoft's vision for the cloud was that everything would eventually be done on the cloud and that at some point in time on-premises environments would completely go away. As it stands right now, though, that doesn't seem to be the case. Hybrid environments have become the norm. But if you think back to Microsoft's vision for the future, Azure AD Connect was probably intended, at least partially, as a tool for migrating on-premises Active Directory environments to the cloud. So it was largely a one-way synchronization tool. There were a couple of things that could be synchronized in the opposite direction, but mostly it was intended for synchronizing data residing in the on-premises Active Directory and moving that data up to the cloud. So the reason why I mention this is because since there wasn't a lot of two-way synchronization going on, passwords were one of those things that didn't get written back to the on-premises Active Directory environment. Now, why does this matter? Well, imagine for a moment that a user happens to go out to Microsoft 365 and they change their password in the cloud. Well, if they change that password in the cloud, they end up with one password in the Azure AD environment. They have another password, their old password, in the on-premises Active Directory. So at that point, the user has a mismatch. They're going to have some difficulties logging in, and chances are they'll probably end up locking themselves out. So you can save yourself a lot of trouble by going in and enabling password write-back. And the way that you do that is simply by launching Azure AD Connect and then going to the optional features and selecting the password write-back checkbox as I've done on this slide. And that will alleviate a lot of problems right there. So now let's talk about user accounts, because as you may recall, when we were setting up Microsoft 365, we were prompted to create user accounts, and I mentioned that we should skip that step for right now. one of the reasons why I suggested skipping that step is because if you do enable Azure AD Connect, then your on-premises user accounts will automatically be migrated to Microsoft Office, so you don't have to worry about manually recreating those accounts. And actually, if you do manually recreate those accounts and you've got duplicates on premises, you can cause a lot of problems. So as you can see on this screen, we have user accounts called user 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And those user accounts were actually created in my on-premises environment and then synchronized to Microsoft 365 by Azure AD Connect. The main thing that I wanted to show you on this slide is that if you look at the licenses column, the user accounts that were synchronized from the on-premises environment are currently showing as unlicensed. So what this means is that right now, these accounts exist in Azure AD, but these users aren't yet licensed to use Microsoft 365. So we need to change that. And the way that we do that is by selecting the user accounts, just as I've done here. And when you select the user accounts, you'll get this pop-up that you see on the right side of the screen. And what you're going to want to do is select the replace option. And the wording on this is a little bit confusing because it says unassign existing licenses and assign new ones. And right now there are no existing licenses, but it will still work. So just select replace, click save changes, and then those users will be licensed to use Microsoft 365. Now, what if you have additional users that you want to add? Maybe you don't have an on-premises environment and you're just setting up from scratch entirely in the Microsoft 365 cloud. Or maybe you've got some new users who are coming on board who don't yet have accounts in either environment. Well, Microsoft does provide a method that you can use to create user accounts in bulk. Now, I'm not going to go into this in a huge amount of detail in the interest of time because there's still a lot that I need to cover. But if I can go back a couple of slides, if you look at the menu bar along the top of the screen, you can see that there's an option to add multiple users. If you click this option, then you end up being taken to this screen right here. And what the screen does is it allows you to download a CSV file, and that CSV file contains a number of headers. And you can then populate that file with information about the user accounts that you want to create, so long as you stick to the conventions that are outlined at the bottom of this slide. So you populate it with user information, you save the file, and then you import that back into Microsoft 365, and it will create the user accounts for you based on the information that you've entered into that file. So let's talk a little bit about security now. Because once we've got this environment all set up, we've brought in our users, it's going to be really important to keep things secure. So there are a number of different things that you should be doing on the security side. Again, I could do an entire presentation on this, but I want to show you a couple of the more important things. One thing that I recommend doing is checking out the Secure Score. I've talked about Secure Score in a couple of previous presentations, but for any of you who might not have attended those, Secure Score is basically a numerical representation that shows you how secure your Microsoft 365 environment is based on what security settings you've enabled. And Microsoft has moved Secure Score around quite a bit. You never know where it's going to pop up within the Microsoft 365 interface, it seems. But at least as it stands right now, you can find it in the Microsoft 365 Defender console. And initially, the Secure Score is going to be blank because it takes Secure Score a couple of days to go in and look at all of your settings and come up with a numerical score that represents your security. But even so, I wanted to go ahead and mention this because this is something that you're going to want to refer back to from time to time as you make improvements to your security, because it gives you a way of quantifying just what a difference those security improvements make, and it also gives you recommendations for other things that you can do to improve your overall security. Another thing that I strongly recommend doing is enabling multi-factor authentication for your users. And this is one of those things that's really easy to do, but it makes a huge difference with regard to the overall security of your Microsoft 365 environment. So let's step through this really quickly. So as you can see, I'm in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, and what you would do is go to Org Settings, that's the tab on the left side of the screen, and then click on Multi-Factor Authentication. There are blue arrows pointing to both of these options. When you do that, you're taken to this screen right here. All you have to do is click Configure Multi-Factor Authentication, and then that's going to take you to this screen. And all you have to do now is select the user accounts for which you want to enable multi-factor authentication, and then click Enable. So that's the basic process for doing that. Another thing that I recommend doing with regard to security is going ahead and downloading and installing the administrative templates for Microsoft Office. Now, what these templates do is they allow you to manage the various Office applications. These are the applications that get installed on users' desktops and laptops. You're able to manage those using group policy so long as the user's device is domain joined. Now, there are a huge variety of settings that are available within group policy once you install these templates. And I would recommend just spending a little bit of time going through and seeing which settings are available and which ones really pertain to your own organization. I'm not making any recommendations with regard to which security settings you should enable, simply because every organization's needs are different and there are such a huge number of security settings that are available to you. But let's take a look at the process for deploying these templates. Assuming that you're doing all of this from a Windows 10 desktop, the first thing that you're going to want to do is to install the group policy management tools. And you can do this by going into settings and then go to apps and then add an optional feature. And then you'll get this big list of optional features. And as you can see, one of those optional features is RSAT, which stands for Remote Server Administration Tools, Group Policy Management Tools. Just select that, click OK, and then that is going to get installed so that you can manage group policy settings from a Windows 10 machine. And again, I am assuming that this is domain joined. So then the next thing that you'll have to do is to download the administrative templates. There's a link at the bottom of the slide as to where you can get those templates from. And you can see what the template files look like on the slide. So the template files themselves consist of two pieces. There's the ADMX files, and those contain the actual settings that are going to be added to group policy. And then we have a bunch of subfolders that have different localizations. For example, EN-US is English US or American English. So these just provide the language for the various group policy settings. So what you'll need to do is unzip the template files that you download and then copy them all out to a folder on your hard drive, just as I've done right here. Specifically, you're going to need the ADMX files, and then you'll need whatever subfolder contains the language that you want to install. And you can install more than one language if you want. Next, what you're going to want to do is create what's known as an Active Directory central store. And the way that you do that is by going to a very specific path. If you look at the address bar in File Explorer, you can see that I've entered dc.posylab.com. That's the fully qualified domain name of my domain controller. And if you've got multiple domain controllers, which most organizations do, just pick one. It doesn't really matter which one you use. So enter the fully qualified domain name of your domain controller, and then sysvol, and then enter your domain name. In my case, it's posylabs.com, and then go to policies. And so once you've done that, you're going to want to create a folder called Policy Definitions, and that's written as one word. There's no space between policy definitions. It has to be entered exactly as you see on this slide right here. If you spell it differently or put a space in it, this won't work. So then once you've created that Policy Definitions folder, what you're going to want to do is to copy all of those files that you saw a moment ago over to the Policy Definitions folder. And then that's going to make those group policy settings related to Microsoft Office available within the group policy editor. So let's take a look at this. So here I've opened the group policy editor for my domain, and I realize that this is a little bit hard to see because the text is so small. But if you look at computer configuration, policies, administrative templates, you can see that there are several administrative templates related to Microsoft Office. We have things like Microsoft Office 2016 machine, Microsoft PowerPoint 2016 machine, Skype for Business, and then there are also user-level policy settings. So these are policy settings that would apply to the individual user session. And those are found under User Configuration, Policies, Administrative Template, Policy Definitions. And that's where we have all of the settings for the individual Office applications. Things like Access, Excel, OneNote, Outlook, and the list goes on and on. Now, we've got all of the group policy settings that we need in order to be able to manage Microsoft Office at the group policy level. But there's one very critical thing that's still missing from this. Let me take this step back, and let's pretend that we never installed any of this. This is the way that the group policy editor normally looks in those locations prior to the installation of those policy settings. Now, if you look at the administrative templates, policy definitions at the machine level, we have things like control panel, network, printers, servers, start menu, and taskbar, system, and so on. Now, if I flip back, you'll notice that those settings don't exist once I've installed the administrative templates for Microsoft 365. So we've got to come up with a way of getting those back. Otherwise, we limit what we're able to do with group policy settings. Fortunately, putting those settings back is really easy to do. On a Windows 10 machine, there's a folder in your C drive called Policy Definitions that exists just beneath the Windows folder. And that Policy Definitions folder contains all of those group policy settings that are related to the things that I just showed you a moment ago. So all you have to do is copy those files directly from your hard drive over to the Policy Definitions folder that you created in the Active Directory Central Store. And then when you do that, that's going to bring back the missing policy settings that are now going to reside alongside the policy settings related to Microsoft Office applications. You can see what that looks like right here. So the last thing that I want to cover is the Office applications. I mentioned at the very beginning of this that there was a way to automate the deployment of Microsoft Office applications. So that's what I want to show you how to do. Typically, when a user signs into the Microsoft 365 console, they're going to be taken to a screen like this, and you have this great big orange box telling the user, click here to install Microsoft Office. And that's perfectly okay. If you want to let users install Office themselves, go for it. There's no reason not to. But if you'd rather have a little bit more control over the process and automate the deployment of the Office applications, you can certainly do that. And the benefit behind that is consistency with regard to the way that the Office applications are installed. And you get to fine-tune the deployment process. You can configure exactly what gets installed and what doesn't get installed. So let's take a look at this. The first thing that you're going to need to do is to download a component called the Office Deployment Tool, and I've provided a link on the slide that you can use to get that tool. So once you've downloaded that tool, copy its contents to a folder on your hard disk. In this case, I've created a folder called ODT, and then I've extracted the contents of the Office Deployment Tool to that folder. And as you can see, there are 3 XML files, and there's a setup.exe file. Now, the setup.exe file probably isn't what you think. If you look at it, it's got the Microsoft Office logo, and it looks like you could just double-click on that file to install Office. But if we try to do that right now, you end up getting this error message right here. So clearly this isn't set up, at least not yet, for deploying Office. There are some things that we have to do. So the first thing that we have to do is to create an XML file that is going to be used to assist with downloading Office. Because remember, there are a lot of different channel releases and editions of Office, and we have to pick the one that we want to deploy, so we have to download the right one. So the easiest way to do that is to take one of those XML files that you see right there and then copy that, use a name of your choosing. I'm using basic.xml, but you can really call it anything that you want. So copy that out to the same folder and then edit that brand new XML file to meet your needs. So if you want to download a 64-bit version of Office, you would choose the configure-office365-x64, and if you wanted to do the 32-bit version, you'd use the configure-office365-x86 file. So just pick the one that best applies to your situation, copy it to a brand new XML file, and then edit it to meet your needs. Now, there's a lot that you can do with these XML files. There's a lot I don't really have time to talk about, but at a bare minimum, the XML file needs to look like this. So this XML file has a configuration section, and in this case, I'm setting the Office Client Edition to 64. That means we're downloading the 64-bit version of Office. We're setting the channel to monthly, and we're setting the product ID to Office 365 Professional Plus Retail Edition. And again, you can set this to meet your own needs. I'm setting the language to EN-US or American English, and that's it. That's the only thing that I'm specifying in this particular XML file. And again, you can make this more elaborate, but this is the bare minimum of what you need to make this work. So once we've got that, we would make sure that that XML file resides in the same folder as the setup.exe file that I showed you a moment ago, and then open up an administrative command prompt window, and then type setup, and then /download, and then the name of the XML file that you just created. And when you do that, the window is going to appear to lock up. It's going to look like nothing's happening, but Office is actually being downloaded in the background. And depending on your connection speed and on how busy Microsoft is at that particular time, this can take quite a while. But when it's done, you'll have a newly created folder called Office that appears beneath the folder containing your setup file. You can see the blue arrow pointing to the Office folder right here. So now we've downloaded a copy of Office. The next thing that we've got to do is to customize that copy of Office so that we can deploy it in an automated fashion. So what you need to do now is go to the Microsoft 365 Apps Admin Center, and this is something that's available on the internet. Just open up Google or whatever and then type Microsoft 365 Apps Admin Center, and you'll come to the screen right here. Now, if you look in the lower left corner of the screen, you can see a Create button, and just above that, there's some text that say Create a new configuration. That's what you're going to want to click. And when you click on that Create button, you'll be taken to this screen right here. And what this screen is essentially just a web form. And you populate this web form with information about how you want Office to be installed. So, for example, you might start out by choosing the architecture that you want to deploy. Do you want 32-bit or 64-bit? From there, you pick which particular Office applications you want to install. And there are a million different questions that you can answer to fine-tune your customized deployment. Now, you don't necessarily have to answer all of these questions. There are a few that are required. For example, you can't get by without selecting a language. But most of the questions on here are optional. And you can really take your time and go through here and answer these questions in a way that really meets your organization's needs. Now, once you've answered all of those questions, then there's an export button at the bottom of the screen. You would click that, and that's going to take you to the screen right here. And this screen asks you to choose the Office file format that you want to use. The default option is to keep using the current settings, but if you don't have current settings in place that you're worried about retaining, then just choose the second option, Office Open XML format. In my opinion, that's the best option to use because this particular XML format supports all of the Office features. So once you've done that, click OK, accept the license agreement, and you'll be prompted to choose a file name for the file that you're creating, and then click Export. And when you do that, an export file is going to be downloaded. And if you're using the Edge browser, you're probably going to get an error at this point because Microsoft Defender is going to see that you're downloading an XML file and think that something malicious is happening. If that happens, just go ahead and allow the download. And then when you're done, copy the XML file from your downloads folder to the folder containing your setup file. Then once you've done that, all you have to do to deploy Office is type setup/configure, and then in this case I've got configuration.xml, just whatever file name you assign to the XML file that you're creating. And that's going to launch an Office setup according to the specifications that you've entered into that XML file. So that's how you perform a customized Office setup. Now in this case, we're obviously just deploying Office to this one PC. But there are any number of different ways that you could scale this up so that you can configure Office on any number of PCs. I've seen this done in login scripts. I've seen this done in application management tools. It's really up to you as to how you put this into practice. So with that said, we've covered a huge amount of material in this presentation, and I'd like to go ahead and open it up for questions before I completely run out of time.
Thank you, Brian. We've got quite a few questions here. Let me see here. Remember, everybody, just want a quick reminder that you can type your questions in the Q&A box at any time, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. So let me go with, let's see. Sorry about this. Let's see. How about this one? Can you add different domains to the same account?
Yes, you can. You would simply need to, once Office has already been deployed and you've configured that initial domain name, just come in later on and add any additional domain names. You'll have to go through that same process that I showed you with regard to verifying domain name ownership. But yeah, you can add multiple domain names to Microsoft 365.
Very cool. This is similar. Can you add a new default domain name after you have completed the setup?
Yes, you can. And incidentally, one thing that I wanted to follow up with that applies to both of those questions is I've stumbled onto documentation out there. I don't know if it still exists, but I've seen documentation that incorrectly states that you need to set up a multi-tenant environment if you've got multiple domains. In other words, have a separate subscription for each domain name, but that is not accurate. You can have multiple domain names associated with a single subscription.
Okay, thank you. Are there ways to deploy Microsoft 365 without installing Skype for Business?
Yes, there are. Okay, that procedure that I showed you just a moment ago with the custom installation, one of the things that you can do is you can pick which applications do and do not get installed. Now, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't remember if I saw Skype for Business on the list or not, but it's got all of the various Microsoft applications listed. And even if Skype for Business isn't listed, you can go in and manually edit the XML file. And there's a section in there, I cannot remember what it's called. You would have to go up and look up the documentation. But there's a section where you can specifically list anything that you don't want to be installed.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so here's one. I am told Microsoft's best practices requires an on-premise Exchange server to remain after email migration in order to be in a Microsoft-supported configuration for administration purposes. Is that true?
You know, I got to be honest with you. I have not heard that. I've seen plenty of organizations that have done a full migration and then removed their Exchange server. I don't know if that violates Microsoft best practices just because I haven't seen a best practice that says that. It may very well exist, but I haven't run into it if it does.
Okay, here's another one. For E5, if I use premium feature in Power Automate, do I still need to pay extra?
You would need to talk to your Microsoft licensing person about that one. I have no idea.
That's kind of what I thought. Let's see. Okay. Office 2016, do these policies apply to M365 apps, to outright owned, locally installed versions of Office? Both?
I'm not sure I completely understand what you're asking.
Me either. Sorry about that. Let's see. Maybe we could get another question here.
Yeah, whoever submitted that, if you want to just clarify the question a little bit, I'd be happy to answer it.
Yeah, that's a great recommendation. Thank you. You briefly mentioned using a file to create user accounts. How does that work?
Okay, what you would do is you download a CSV file template. There's a link for it right where you click on Create Bulk Users, and you download it. And what that template is it's an Excel spreadsheet, and it's got column headers for all of the pieces of information that have to be populated for each user account. So what you would do is just save a copy of that and then start adding your user information to that file. Things like your first and last name, usernames, maybe department. I think you can even do a default password, but once you've populated that spreadsheet, there's an import option, and you simply pull that CSV file into Office, and the user accounts within that spreadsheet are created on the fly. So you don't have to worry about going through and manually creating every single user.
Awesome. Thank you. So this attendee asks, I have a mixed environment, Mac and PC. How much applies to Mac? I'm assuming your presentation today.
Honestly, I have no idea. I have only touched Mac on the rarest of occasions. I'm sorry, I know that's a terrible answer, but it's the truth.
Well, you're a Windows guy, so. Okay, how about this one? Can I use the slides in your presentation as a full step-by-step guide for deploying Office 365 in my organization?
For the most part, I would say yes. There are a couple of really intuitive steps that I skipped over just in the interest of not having, a gazillion slides. But for the most part, yeah, it should be able to walk you through that, so long as you remember that there are some things that are going to be unique to your own environment.
Here's another one. Is there an option to pin Microsoft apps to the taskbar?
Yes, there is.
Nuts and bolts?
Yeah, I believe you can actually do that through group policy settings. It's not the Microsoft 365 application group policies that I showed you how to install the template for, but there is a separate group policy setting. I believe it's under the taskbar, under administrative templates, but I'm not positive on that location. You'd want to double check me on that.
Cool, thank you. So do I really need to set up Azure AD Connect? I thought that the whole point of Office 365 was to be able to run everything in the cloud.
Yeah, if you want to run absolutely everything in the cloud, you are certainly free to do that. You only need Azure AD Connect if you have an on-premises Active Directory environment and you want to synchronize that environment to Microsoft 365 so that you've got user accounts that work for accessing both on-premises resources and resources in Microsoft 365. If you're starting from square one and you don't have that on-premises Active Directory, or you're not worried about linking it to Microsoft 365, then you're not going to need Azure AD Connect. It's only there for directory synchronization purposes.
Okay. All right. Let's see if I can get this. How to deploy this so it is set to Office 2019, a block option to update to Office 2021 when available. Something about a curriculum written in 2019. I was hoping that might make sense to you. It's a little.
Oh, okay. So I'm understanding this correctly. Then there was something that was specifically built on the 2019 version, and you want to block an upgrade.
Yes.
Okay. Off the top of my head, I'm not really sure. I'm wanting to say that if you're not on the semi-annual channel release, the semi-annual channel release, I believe, gives you updates every 6 months. You can defer those, I think, for up to a year. But beyond that, there's not really a lot that you can do to block it. If you're on one of the other releases, you probably got a bit more control. But again, that's something you would want to check the documentation on. I'm just not sure off the top of my head.
Okay. So here's one. Can I install Hybrid Exchange to simplify updating AD Connect synced account email details?
Can you repeat that question?
Sure. Can I install Hybrid Exchange to simplify updating AD Connect synced account email details?
Yeah, I don't see why not.
There you go. That was a straight up answer. Okay. Is there a limit to the number of files in SharePoint in a SharePoint site?
Yes, there is. I don't remember what that limit is off the top of my head, but there is definitely a cap on the number of files that can be stored within a single SharePoint site. It's probably listed on that SharePoint storage limits page that I linked to in the presentation. But even if it's not on that page, I've stumbled across it, and I know absolutely 100% that, yes, that limit does exist.
Okay. Thank you for that. If we want to migrate to Office 365 and Teams, which would you recommend doing first? Currently, we have Exchange and GoToMeeting.
Okay. So the question is, somebody is thinking about upgrading to Microsoft 365, and they also want to have Teams, but right now they've got an on-premises Exchange environment, and they've got GoToMeeting.
Exactly.
My advice would probably be to start with Exchange, unless you've got a really compelling reason to move away from GoToMeeting, maybe something that's not working quite right for you that you've got to resolve. The reason why I say that is because if you go ahead and migrate Exchange, that's going to take care of a lot of the underlying things that Teams depends on. Teams actually uses Exchange for data storage. It also uses some of the other Microsoft 365 applications to store data in. So if you go ahead and do Exchange first, then that's going to kind of lay the groundwork for Teams.
Great. Okay. What are your thoughts on migrating on-prem file shares into Teams/SharePoint?
It can be done. Honestly, I kind of prefer keeping a file server. That's the way that my own organization is set up, is everything is still in file servers. And the reason for that is I just feel like it gives me a little bit more control over everything. I feel like it's a bit easier to back up, a bit easier to maintain permissions. But if you've got a business reason for moving files into SharePoint or into Teams, then you can certainly do that. Just take a look to make sure that all of your data types that are in that file server are supported in those environments.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Let's see. One attendee is letting you guys know that it's the SharePoint limits to 300,000 files per site right now.
Cool.
Good to know. Thank you. So thoughts on, okay, we did where to find documents. Let's see, could you repeat? Okay, I hope I don't screw this one up. If our AAD is good, users, devices, conditional access policies, etc., what else do we need to move off the server? How or do we move GPOs?
Move off of the server. I'm assuming they mean move away from an on-premises environment?
That's my guess, too. If our ADD is good, users don't. What else do we need to move off the server? Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry.
If you're looking to move entirely into the Azure cloud, there's a chance that a lot of those group policy objects are going to be completely irrelevant. Honestly, what I would recommend, because this is so organization-specific, would be to just go out and set up a trial Azure subscription, restore it back up to a couple of machines, set up a domain controller that mimics what you've got on premises, and maybe set up a couple of application servers or whatever, kind of a small-scale representation of your production environment, and just try it and see if anything goes wrong. That's going to be the absolute safest way to approach it, because not knowing the specifics of your environment, it's not really possible for me to tell you, oh, this is going to work, or no, it's not going to work.
Oh, wow. It looks like that's all the questions we have time for. Thanks, Brian, for a great session, and thanks to our sponsors for making it possible. Be sure to check out Posey's Moonshot, a chronicle of Brian's commercial space flight training he's writing right now from Redmond Magazine. Thanks so much, Brian.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And a lot of what I've been covering in this presentation is going to also show up in my Posey's Tips and Tricks blog on Redmond in the near future.
A must read. Okay, now we're going to take a short break. We'll be back at the top of the hour for our second session, Top Security Concerns Every Enterprise Must Know for Office 365 and Microsoft 365, featuring Microsoft MVP and Certified Solutions Master Nathan O'Brien, and moderated by my colleague David Rammel, Editor-in-Chief of Virtualization and Cloud Review. This would be a good time to check out those resources on your console, so generously provided by our sponsors. And remember, during today's third session, we will be giving away a Nintendo Switch. So stay tuned.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and of course our sponsors, Chaosoft, AvaPoint, Metallic, Druva, and BitTitan, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. My name is David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, and I'm here to moderate the second session of our Microsoft Office 365 for Enterprises Summit, called Top Security Concerns Every Enterprise Must Know for Office 365 and Microsoft 365. Our speaker for this session is Nathan O'Brien. Living in Portland, Oregon, Nathan is a Microsoft Certified Solutions Master messaging and a 5-time former Microsoft MVP for Office servers and services. He specializes in Exchange, Office 365, Active Directory, Azure, and even a bit of Teams. Nathan works as an independent consultant and actively contributes to the Exchange and Office 365 communities by writing articles for several tech websites and his own blog. Nathan, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, and welcome, everybody. So we've got quite a lot of attendance here, so we will try and get through this information. I've got quite a bit of stuff to cover here today. I will make my best effort to get it all in the limited amount of time that I have. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A panel there. We will get to those at the end of my little talk here. We'll make sure we try and go through as many of those questions as we possibly can, so that everybody's all caught up and everything's everything's good, but I've got a ton to cover, so I'm going to get started here. All right, so we're talking about kind of security concerns for your Office 365 deployment. Kind of the first thing that I think is real important to point out is that if you have data that's valuable to you, it's also valuable to someone else, maybe just because it's valuable to you. So it's super important to look at the security for your Office 365 deployment. Make sure that you're keeping everything as secure as possible, keeping the bad guys out. I pulled last week when I was writing this, I just pulled a couple of headlines there from a couple of security concerns just off a standard news feed, but there's obviously a lot of reasons why it's very important to review the security of your Office 365 deployment and make sure that it's all secure as it can be. So when we start talking about making your Office 365 deployment secure, I like to start off with customers making it clear that the goal really should be to make Office 365, to make your entire IT department and your organization more secure. Let's try to make it more secure every day. Keep pushing forward. Security isn't really just a one and done kind of thing, something that we can turn on a specific switch and then we're all magically secure. There's a lot of work into this. Far too often, I think I talk to customers and they really want a quick solution, make everything secure, make it good now. And there's a number of reasons why that's really not the way to go. A lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about today, a lot of the features and functionality, they require work to implement, to maintain, and to make sure that your users are trained and understand. So I really want to encourage people not to think of security as, let's flip this switch, get everything on, and make everything secure. Think of it as a journey, kind of a constant, never-ending journey where it's always trying to make your deployment, your information more secure instead of trying to get to that end point, that finish line. So I've kind of tried to organize this talk here in a way that some of the more basic features we'll talk about up front, stuff that you should turn on as soon as possible, make things more secure today. And then, some of the more advanced features that might take some time. I'm obviously not going to be able to get into everything in a lot of depth. But if you have questions, of course, about specific features, of course, bring those up and we'll try and address those later. But this is going to be kind of a high-level flyover of a bunch of really cool security features that are available in Office 365. And of course, I'm not going to be talking about the licensing for these features here much. That is, I could spend hours and hours talking about licensing separately from this. And the licensing for Office 365 can get very in-depth and confusing. And what feature do I get with what license level? I'll try and mention some of that kind of high level as we fly by it, but not too much really going to focus on the licensing part of this. First Office 365 feature that we really need to talk about, address, bring up, and turn on for everybody is multi-factor authentication. Every Office 365 tenant, every Office 365 account logging into Office 365 has some level of access to multi-factor authentication, and you absolutely want to have as much multi-factor authentication on across your organization as much as possible. I took some statistics here that I put up on the screen from, I believe, a talk that Microsoft gave at a conference last year. Not super current, but it's from last year, and I think all these statistics, apply to everybody. Really still relevant. In January 2020, Microsoft found 1.2 million compromised accounts in their Microsoft Cloud, and 99.9% of those accounts didn't have MFA turned on. So again, if you're here, you're obviously concerned about security for your Office 365 tenant, and the first most important step that you can take to ensure that that's there is to turn on multi-factor authentication. Make sure your users are using multi-factor authentication to get into your tenant that will save a whole bunch of trouble for you down the road. Microsoft says that only about 11% of enterprise users have ever had even a single MFA claim against their authentication into the Microsoft cloud. So I find that really, really shocking, disturbing, troublesome, that so few people are using multi-factor authentication to access Office 365. Just a username and password is not enough to keep it secure. Really need to be using that multi-factor authentication. And I'm not going to go super detail into all the different types of multi-factor authentication that are available in Office 365. But there are different. You can do phone calls, you can do SMS, that sort of stuff. Really, the Authenticator app is the most secure of those multi-factor authentication options, and it's really easy to use. I would highly recommend, prefer towards that multi-factor or that Authenticator app for your multi-factor authentication on your Office 365 accounts. Really, we want to get there. That's the goal, and it's really usable, easy to use, not much education for users to get them using that. Highly recommended, and it will save you a bunch of trouble. If you don't take anything else away from this today, really an urgency for multi-factor authentication is terribly important. All right, next thing I wanted to talk about here is privileged identity management, PIM. So for a long time in the IT world, the recommendation has been, for us as IT professionals running our Office 365 tenants, we should have our primary account that we log into, do our day-to-day work. We have our email on, we store our files and access it with that account, and then have a separate administrator account for those admin functions that are more secure, more important, have greater ability to affect the configuration of the tenant as a whole. What privileged identity management does is it gives us the ability to on-demand elevate our accounts with those admin rights through a simple web portal or through PowerShell without having to use two separate accounts. So this is a screenshot from my personal, and all these screenshots are going to be from my personal Office 365 tenant here, which is really just me. I'm really the only user in it, so some of this stuff shows a little bit limited. And doesn't have the in-depth information that a larger tenant with a bunch of users in it would have. But this is me. This is my account in Office 365. What I do for my account is I have view-only admin rights that is always assigned to my account. So anytime I want to go into Office 365 and look at the settings, understand the configuration of a specific item, I have the rights to do that, but my account normally doesn't have the rights to change anything. I have to go into privileged identity management and grant myself an elevated role before I have any of those rights to change anything using that same account. Privileged identity management also gives you really a lot of functionality and flexibility in how that is implemented. You can give users the ability to just grant themselves specific admin rights, or that can be set up with an approval flow so that if you want specific roles, if you want to be global admin maybe, then you need a management approval for that. And there is a space in that approval flow where you can put a justification for why you're doing that, which I think is always a good idea, to set up that company policy that, if the people, if your administrators need higher elevated rights, they can grant themselves those rights, or they can request to have those rights granted, and they can put a justification in there for, I'm working on ticket number XYZ, or I'm enabling this function, or I'm doing, whatever the reason that you need those elevated rights for. You can explain that. And then, of course, those rights are also time limited automatically. So when I grant myself global admin rights, I have it set up so that's basically for the day, for about 8 hours. And if at the end of the time that, my day is up, I forget about that, that's automatically going to be revoked from my account. My account will go back to that normal user rights level so that, overnight, over the weekend, or however much time that it is until I need those admin rights again. My account isn't just sitting there with those admin rights. So privileged identity management is a really handy feature. I believe you have to have Azure Active Directory Premium P2 to use privileged identity management. It's a good feature, highly recommended, and it gets us away from having to have multiple admin accounts and that sort of thing. We can just use the one account and have those rights using privileged identity management. Next feature I want to talk about, this is on the Microsoft 365 Defender website, which is security.microsoft.com. A lot of these features are going to be highlighted from that page. That's also the really Microsoft 365 Defender, which we'll talk about towards the end of the presentation. But this is where a lot of the tools that I'm going to talk about can be surfaced for you. Secure Score tool. This is a really handy tool that looks at your Office 365 tenant and makes recommendations for you on how you can apply better security in your tenant. Features and functionality that you can turn on and make your tenant more secure. You know, again, this is kind of what I'm talking about with the let's make things more secure every day. Go through the Secure Score tool. It will tell you you've turned on this and this feature, but hey, we recommend you'll use this feature. You can kind of gamify it with that percentage secure score there, that secure score. That tells you, you know, how you're getting there and shows that you're making progress. Another screenshot here. Let me advance this. You know, going into the secure score, I pulled up. There's a bunch of recommendations here at the top. Things that I can do to make my tenant more secure. These don't necessarily apply to me in my situation, so I haven't set them all up. But you can see I have a bunch of stuff that I have set up to make my tenant more secure, and there's more recommendations, things that I can do to better improve the security of my Office 365 tenant. I don't believe there's any licensing for this. You can just go in security.microsoft.com right now. You can see the secure score for your tenant, and it gives you these recommendations. If you were to go into any one of these specific recommendations, the screen kind of looks like this. You can see there on the right-hand side, it gives you detailed instructions how to turn on this recommended feature, what you can do, and then on the left-hand side there, you can mark each of the individual items with a specific action plan. This has been completed, we're in progress. You can kind of write notes for other administrators in your organization about where you are with implementing these features. You see on mine, the left-hand side is grayed out there. That's, again, because of the privileged identity management. I don't have the rights to edit that immediately, or normally when I took this screenshot, I was logged in with just a view-only admin rights, so I can't edit anything here. But if I needed to edit it, I would grant myself as global admin rights or whatever the appropriate rights were for a specific feature. Then I'd have the ability to edit these. Anyway, this gives you tons of information on recommendations to make Office 365 more secure for your environment. Go through, gives you detailed, good instructions on how to accomplish each of the tasks that it talks about, and ways for you to keep track of where your progress is in securing your tenants so that you can communicate to other members of your IT team or security team about where you are in that security process. Really, this is a great tool. I highly recommend that everybody take a look at this and make a plan to move forward and implement better security in your tenant. Really good stuff. Next thing I want to talk about within that Defender 365 portal, you'll see on the left there's a tab I clicked on for the Learning Hub. Microsoft is really doing a good job of making training and information available for everyone who has an Office 365 tenant about what these features are. It obviously benefits Microsoft greatly if they can teach you how to use these features. So they've put a lot of work into creating this Learning Hub here for you. So if your organization is interested in security, obviously you are, because you're here listening to us today, this is a great place where you can go in. You can see some short video clips. There's different types of information that you can get here. Some of it's video clips. Some of it's you can build little labs and play with some of these features. I think I have another slide showing you some of that later. So one of the things, obviously, that I always stress with customers is Office 365 is never static. It's always evolving. Microsoft is always adding new features and functionality. They're improving Office 365. They're super concerned about security. But as they do that, we as IT professionals and even our end users need to continue to be educated about how everything works, how it all works together, and what we should be doing to keep everything secure. So I think education is a huge part of having a good security plan. Us as administrators, we need to learn how these features and functionality work, and we need to make sure that our end users and our management in an organization really understand all that so that we can keep everything as secure as possible. Education, super important. Microsoft goes to great lengths to make this easier for us to keep up with all these features and functionality. On that kind of end user training situation, this is a great tool that's available here on security.microsoft.com. It's a phishing tool. You can set up campaigns here to phish your own users and understand what they know about phishing, how they're keeping their accounts secure. So within this portal, you can generate a specific phishing attempt and send it all to all of your users, and then see who does what with it. See how users are responding to that phishing attempt. Are they clicking on links? Are they being phished? It will record that information for you and make it easier for you to educate your users. Highly recommend everybody use this. Phish your own people. Understand who needs more education, who's clicking on links they shouldn't be clicking on, so that you can inform users and help them stay secure, keep your data secure. Ransomware gets in this way to most tenants where ransomware is a big threat. Most of the time, it's going to get in by a phishing email being sent to users and then somebody clicking on a link that they really shouldn't be clicking on. This is a great way to educate your users, test them, keep them current. Let me advance this slide here. I believe I show it has a bunch of different simulation trainings, like 120 different payloads that you can send to users, phishing attempts that look different, so that we can keep this current, we can run this continually, and we can keep testing our users and understand who needs that additional training, who's doing a good job, so that we can help keep our environment secure. Education, again, is really the key. If your users are well educated, your administrators are well educated, it's a lot easier to keep your data secure. Highly recommend using this. It's a great tool. Make sure that everybody's up to date and they're taking the right actions, keeping your Office 365 data secure. And then when we talk about that securing mail flow, I wanted to touch really briefly on the encryption that's available for email. People ask me this a lot. There are TLS 1.0 and 1.1 are old, shouldn't be used. It's not a problem in Office 365, but if you have that on-premises Exchange server, highly recommend that's connected to your Office 365. Highly recommend that you disable those earlier versions of TLS. Use TLS 1.2, way more secure, keeps everything better. And then also with encryption, it's important to understand what kind of encryption, email encryption that your users want to use. Office 365 message encryption is a service that you get with Exchange Online licenses. That really what it does is when you trigger it to encrypt an email, it stores that email on a web server so that the recipients of it can access it through a web browser, HTTPS, so that secure both directions. Users can reply to those messages. They don't have to be Office 365 customers, don't have to be even sending to an Exchange account. You can send an OME encrypted message to a Gmail account or any other sort of mail system. It works great. Great way to keep encrypted email. Some people ask about S-MIME. Not used a whole lot. S-MIME is much more complicated email encryption to maintain because it requires each person that has S-MIME set up to have their own certificate. And then that certificate for S-MIME, it gives other people the ability to download your public key and send you encrypted email, but you can't send, using S-MIME, encrypted email out to anyone else. It's really a one-way encryption sort of product. It's good, but it's much more difficult to use, requires maintaining certificates that may be installed on multiple workstations for your users. So I recommend go with that Office 365 message encryption, which is very easy to use. Users can understand it. S-MIME email encryption is much more complicated. You want to limit the deployment of that because large training experience for the end user to be able to use that, and it's kind of complicated. Next thing I wanted to talk about, kind of rushing through a bunch of stuff here because, again, we've got a ton of features to cover and limited time to do it. If you do have any questions, though, about anything I'm talking about, again, please feel free to put those questions in the portal, and we'll leave time at the end to get to those questions and make this all more clear for everybody if you have those questions. Endpoint management, formerly Intune. Microsoft is working to integrate the System Center Configuration Manager and Intune, so they've renamed them all to be Endpoint Management, trying to make those work together. You can use co-management, so they can both exist, managing a single computer. You can have a single workstation that is managed by your on-premises SCCM, as well as endpoint management, Intune, together. That will enable different features and functionality within that endpoint management, depending on what capabilities you have on premises turned on and configured. Endpoint management is a really good way to ensure that your users are using secure devices. It allows you to do things like monitor the applications that users have installed on their machine. You can ensure that they're patched and up to date. You can ensure they have things like drive encryption turned on. You can turn that on for Windows machines so that, if somebody takes their laptop home and loses it, that data, whatever's stored locally on that laptop will be encrypted. And there's, a bunch of other kind of security settings that you can get into in Intune and make sure that all the devices are well protected. Works great for Android, iPhone, Windows 10, kind of older versions of Windows. You may have more limited access to control the features. Windows 8.1 supports some. Then you get back to Windows 7, there's very little that you can do with that. Also, endpoint management gives us the ability to do both mobile device management and mobile application management. Very important for bring your own device situations. So the full mobile device management, which gives us complete control over the device, is really intended for corporate-owned devices. Most organizations, though, people want to be able to access their email from their own phone. So Intune, endpoint management, does give us the ability to do mobile application management where all we're managing is our data within, say, the Outlook app. We can block users from using other apps or the native client on their iPhone or Android and only allow them to use that Outlook app. And then we can manage all the data within that Outlook app. So if somebody leaves the company, you can be assured and secure that they're not leaving with your organization's data. You can manage your data without having to take full control of the whole phone. Or you can install the company portal app to get that full mobile device management feature set on your users' devices. Probably not appropriate for bring your own device type situations, but every organization has to decide for themselves how they're going to control that. Defender for Endpoint, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. So I get a lot of questions about what is Defender for Endpoint. That's the the Windows 10 antivirus solution. Well, yes, it is. It does do antivirus, but it does a lot more than that. It integrates, Defender for Endpoint integrates very deeply with Windows 10, and it enables some of the other features that we're going to talk about in Office 365 security, so that you can really have good control over that device that user is using, integrate with Intune, integrate with Cloud App Security, and gather a bunch of information about those devices that their users are using. Make sure that you know what applications they're using, how they're accessing them, keep everything logged, and then as we'll get a little farther into these features, we'll show the incident responsibilities within Microsoft tools, so that when a user does have a problem, something's infected, something like that, you can have a good way to recognize when that's happening and prevent larger outbreaks, big virus infections, or data loss, or ransomware attacks, that sort of thing. Defender is really a lot more than just a simple virus scanner. Integrates deeply into the Windows 10 operating system, gives really a lot of behavioral sensors so that we can tell when the users are accessing different applications, how they're using our data, keep your data secure. We'll talk about how we can use Defender for Endpoint, for instance, to know if people are trying to take a bunch of data out of Office 365 into other applications that maybe we don't even control at all. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Defender for Endpoint is a great advanced threat tool to install on the workstations that can really help you control your data in Office 365. Only about 15 minutes left here before we get to the Q&A. Defender for Endpoint does have this evaluation hub, so I highly recommend, again, education. Microsoft makes it relatively easy for you to get in and play with these tools, understand what they're doing to the workstations. This evaluation hub, you can spin up some virtual machines, have virtual devices, really get into what's being secured, what's being monitored, how it works, how it's going to affect your users. So make sure that you're aware of how these features work before you start rolling them out to your users. Great training available here in the hub, security.microsoft.com, right there, that evaluation hub on the left-hand side. Great tool, understand the stuff better, gives you more control, and helps you keep everything secure. Device configuration management within security.microsoft.com. So we talked a little bit about Intune, that endpoint management. I don't have it set up in my portal, but you can use Intune to inventory your user devices, control that mobile device management, mobile application management, and then Intune can feed its information back here into Defender 365 so that we can use a lot of these features together, integrate these features, and give us a lot better protection than if we have just separate solutions from different companies that aren't talking to each other. So we can inventory our Intune information into the hub. Then when a user is infected with a virus, creates malware, we'll have a central hub where we can see these incidents. I'll show you some incidents and alerts here in a little bit. It gives us a more centralized place where we can get all that information together, which I think is really important. Everybody's busy. We don't have time to jump to a bunch of different web portals to look for our features, kind of understand that security. If we can have a centralized place for that, it's really handy. So this is one of the great features that Office 365 brings us, is the ability to combine these signals into a single portal and then make decisions on the risk of corruption or infection problems within a single portal, single pane of glass. Cloud App Security, another great feature available in that EMS E5 Microsoft 365 license. Cloud App Security is kind of complicated, so I'm going to break it down really quick for everybody. It does do a lot of things, but not everybody fully understands them. It can be real complex. Cloud App Security does work kind of like a reverse proxy. It's a Cloud Access Security Broker, CASB. that can sit in between your client and the internet, so that we can manage and we can understand what users are doing, even in applications that we don't own and run through our IT department. So this can be really helpful with that sort of shadow IT problem. An example of that would be if you have Defender endpoint security installed on your workstations, and a user, say they have their own Box account. Maybe a user gives his gives his notice, says, hey, I'm leaving the company. And then, because of the configuration that you have between Cloud App Security and Endpoint, you can see when that user copies, 10 gigs of files from your I don't know, your secret sauce and copies that out to a Box account. The combination of endpoint security and cloud app security together will actually give you that visibility in one place where you can see when users are doing that sort of thing without having to look over everybody's shoulder. You can get notified how that's working. Cloud app security works a couple of different ways. It can serve as that kind of reverse proxy filter, as I said, but it also has API integration with a lot of third-party applications so that you can get really good control. Like Box is one that I mentioned. You can have Cloud App Security integrate into Box even though your organization doesn't have Box accounts, so you understand what users are doing. Salesforce is another one. There's a list of probably about 15 really popular third-party cloud applications that Cloud App Security integrates with and can monitor for you your users' usage of those, even if you don't subscribe to those services. Then Cloud App Security also natively integrates, of course, with Microsoft solutions so that you can monitor and control what users are doing. We'll show you some of the alerts and incidents pop up. You can get the information on what your users are doing, even across the Microsoft stack really well, and control that into, again, single portals. API integration with many large cloud apps, I didn't list them all here, works as a reverse proxy, endpoint integration, and it allows you to monitor user behavior and do investigations into what's going on. So when you see somebody's copying a bunch of data out of your Office 365 tenant into another third-party solution, maybe that's somebody that you need to ask them some more questions and figure out what's going on there. We'll start questions here in a few minutes. I have a bunch of stuff still to cover, but going a little quick, so ask those questions if you have any. This is Cloud App Security. Kind of showed the alerts here from my tenant. Nothing super exciting there, but I did have like an unfamiliar login. So I logged in from, I don't know, I guess it was a different computer that I don't normally use, or from a different location or a different IP address. Cloud App Security can really bring those alerts up to you and help you understand them, but it can also integrate into user risk scores so that if somebody logs in from an unfamiliar computer or in an unfamiliar location into your Office 365 tenant, you can use other features like conditional access to trigger more, a different authentication flow for that user. So maybe if a user logs in from, China when this is a U.S.-based user, maybe force that user to reset their password, or make them call the help desk and have somebody verify that this is a good authentication going on, or at the least add more levels of your multi-factor authentication to those logins so that risky logins can really be identified, managed, and you can keep your information secure. Of course, this portal here, all the Cloud App Security incidents kind of show up there, and you can absolutely review them. Next page, oh, nope, that's not it. You can click on any of these, like that top risky sign-in I had. You can click on it. It gives you information about where that sign-in was from, how that alert got triggered, and then you can do an investigation follow-up and mark that as, yes, this is an okay authentication. The user was just on vacation in Fiji when they logged in, or you can, if there's a problem, you have a compromised account, you can deal with that all right here from this portal. This is the kind of the home page for Defender 365 or Microsoft 365 Defender. Again, that URL is security.microsoft.com. You can see at the top there, it gives you a lot of information. This is where you get to tools like Secure Score and the threat analytics and that endpoint management. All of that is in this one single portal. Makes management a lot easier, gives you the ability to keep Office 365 much more secure. You have a centralized pane of glass where you can see all your security threats and keep everything up to date. Next thing I wanted to show here, this is the incident management in Microsoft 365 Defender. So you can see it lists different attacks, different potential risks that may be occurring. Microsoft does have security researchers. Obviously, they invest a ton in keeping Office 365 secure. So you'll see a bunch of information here. Currently impacted events. I have next page here. I think it shows a couple of incidents I had in my mailbox, a couple of phishing attempts that were sent to my mailbox. Those were recorded here in this desktop. Of course, I only have the one real user in my Office 365 tenant, so there's not a ton here. But if you've got a real tenant with 5,000 users here, you'll see information here about when phishing attacks happen against users. That will come up, it will populate here, and you can deal with that. You can click on one of these incidents. It gives you more information about what kind of attack it was, what the virus was, and you can manage those. The alerts here, these are different alerts across my tenant, email messages. I think they're mostly malware attacks against my account. Somebody sent me spam email. Again, if you have more users in here, this would obviously be more populated. You have a lot more going on. But this is really a great place for you to manage the security of your Office 365 tenant. Really good features and functionalities available for you here. Threat analytics. So threat analytics is that Microsoft security team staying ahead of threats, making sure that you understand threats that are out there in the wild and things you can do to prevent them. So this lists, how many WannaCry sort of emails happened into my tenant or simulated threats or specific Microsoft vulnerabilities. So there's, in the last few weeks, there was a print spooler vulnerability that was found, and so that populates here. You can see that, you can learn about that, and then it also, if you clicked on that, it would give you the remediation steps, what you need to do, patches you need to apply to keep your Office 365 tenant secure. Threat Analytics is a great pane of glass that your security administrators, your IT team can really be looking into to stay current with threats out there in the world. Microsoft invests a bunch of money in keeping Office 365 secure. So as they do that, they populate this so that you don't have to spend as much time and effort understanding all the threats that are out there in the world. It's available, populated here for you, and can help you keep your tenant secure, everything safe. So Defender 365, that pane of glass that really we've been showing, brings a lot of these other Microsoft security signals into a central portal for you. Gives you ways to manage those logs and do investigations into the threats that are popping up across your Office 365 tenant. Keep everything more secure. It's really great tools. And of course, if we have any more specific questions about any of that, I think we've got about 15 minutes here left. Well, actually about 10 minutes left. We're going to cut off a couple minutes before the top of the hour, so we're ready to go into that last session of the day. So at this time, what Q&A do we have? What questions do we have?
Okay, great stuff, Nathan. And we will take some reader questions now. And I'd like to remind the audience that we can answer questions until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next presentation, so send them on in. Let's get started. First question comes from Trevor. Can additional apps be monitored with cloud app security more than the 15 or so included apps?
Right. So if you use that Defender for Endpoint Protection, what that does is it sits and gives you kind of that reverse proxy functionality from your computers, from your users' workstations. So yes, it can monitor a lot more than just those 15 apps that it has the API integration for. Obviously, that doesn't give you as much information, but it does work as a reverse proxy, can monitor information and log what kind of cloud applications your users are connecting to. So say somebody invents a new file storage application next week, and that becomes really popular. Obviously Microsoft Cloud App Security isn't going to be integrated into whatever this new cloud application is, but because it works as a reverse proxy, it can still see your users' behavior, your users connecting out to the internet without you having to have that. Even if users are working from home or other locations that aren't your network that you can control. So yes, it absolutely can. Obviously, it's not quite as good. It doesn't give you as much information as it can for those 15 or whatever API integrated applications, but it absolutely does work, yes.
Okay, great. Nathan, I know you said that we're going to talk too much about licensing because it's such a broad, complicated area, but Rob from the audience asked, do you need a special license to try Defender Lab? We're looking at replacing our semantic endpoint protection with Defender for Endpoint.
I don't believe you do. I think you can go into, if you have an Office 365 tenant, you can go into security.microsoft.com and go right to that labs feature, and then you can start playing with it from there. So no, I don't think you need licensing to use that evaluation in those labs.
Okay, great. I'd like to remind the audience we have plenty of time for questions, so send them on in and take advantage of Nathan's specialized expertise. Here's a question from CE in the audience. He asks, does PIM work in a hybrid environment as well?
It kind of depends. So PIM, Privileged Identity Management, really only manages your Azure Active Directory account. So if you're in that hybrid environment where you have an on-premises Active Directory, and then that's synced through AAD Connect into your Azure Active Directory, it's really just the Azure Active Directory part that Privileged Identity Management is managing. There is, within Windows Server 2019, if your Active Directory is upgraded to that level, there is a very similar feature, a lot more complex to set up on premises, but there is a similar feature within Active Directory or the newer versions of Active Directory that you can use. It's a lot more complicated to set up and manage because it's obviously an on-premises application, not a cloud app that Microsoft is taking care of for you. But there is an equivalent feature in Active Directory, yes.
Okay. Next question comes from Asaya. The question reads, in a hybrid M365 deployment, should we turn on MFA for the AD sync account?
Again, that multi-factor authentication within Azure Active Directory is really applying to your Azure Active Directory account, so that cloud portion of it. So that doesn't turn on multi-factor. Turning on MFA or MFA in your Office 365 tenant isn't automatically going to have users using multi-factor authentication on premises outside of your Office 365 authentication flow. That being said, of course, there are a bunch of different multi-factor authentication options that you can use on premises. And then, of course, you can use tools like ADFS so that you're using your on-premises account to authenticate into Office 365. So there are ways that you can use the same MFA solution both on-premises and in Office 365. But by default, that MFA in Office 360 in Azure Active Directory really just applies to the Azure Active Directory account, not your on-premises Active Directory account.
Okay, great. And let's go to the next question. It's popped in from Zohair. Say we have admin roles in AD. How does AD know what admin roles are assigned in Azure? Is there security groups we need to set up?
Right. So again, when you're syncing your on-premises Active Directory account into Azure Active Directory, those are two separate accounts. They are linked. When you set up AAD Connect, the master you can't really manage those Azure Active Directory accounts directly in the cloud. You have to make changes to them on premises, and then those changes are synced up. But those are two separate accounts. So I feel like this is kind of the same question we've heard 2 or 3 times. You do have to be careful and understand that setting up AAD Connect and syncing your accounts from your on-premises Active Directory into Azure Active Directory doesn't really affect your on-premises accounts in any way. It's just a one-way copy from your on-premises Active Directory into Azure Active Directory. So if you make a change in your on-premises account, those changes are synced up where applicable into Azure Active Directory, but they're two separate accounts. And if you log in to an application that you have stored, that's in your on-premises Active Directory that doesn't have anything to do with Azure Active Directory, the Azure Active Directory features aren't going to apply to your on-premises Active Directory account. They are two separate accounts.
Okay, good. Here's a question from Cedric. For suspicious activity and login alerts, does CAS capture the IP address for mobile devices? For example, bring your own devices and or organization-owned devices.
I'm not sure what CAF refers to, specifically condition.
CAS. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that specifically applies to, but yes, whenever you log into Azure Active Directory, the IP address of that login session is recorded. Whether you have a license feature for that or not, that IP address is recorded so that when you do have license features like conditional access, for instance, you can design specific authentication flows that contain information that vary based on information of that login session. So IP address can absolutely be one of those. You can set up conditional access with, say, if users come into the office and they're using compliant devices, they don't need to do multi-factor authentication. You feel they're secure enough that way. So that IP information is always recorded, may not be surfaced in different portals or different features and functionalities for you to see, depending on your licensing level, but it is recorded and your authentication, Microsoft knows what IP address you're authenticating from, yes.
Okay. Following along on the cloud app security topic, Rob asked, what type of license is needed for cloud app security?
Again, not 100% sure on the licensing, but I believe that's an EMS E5 license or Microsoft 365 E5 license. There are a couple different ways that you can get cloud app security. I believe there is a separate one. You can just license cloud app security, for instance. But it is part of the EMS E5 package and the Microsoft 365 E5 package as well. And there might be other licenses that allow you to access that. It is expensive.
Okay. Zohair has a follow-up question. As for Microsoft Defender, by assigning a license for a user, does it automatically apply to their profile on their AD account? What if there is another AV in place?
No. So when you apply a license for really any Office 365 or Microsoft 365 account, again, that's applying to the Azure Active Directory license. So if you're looking for that Defender for Endpoint Management functionality, you still have to set up Defender for Endpoint Management, ensure that it's installed on the user's workstation even after it's licensed. So there is more to it than just assigning the license. It doesn't necessarily automatically apply to your on-premises Active Directory accounts.
Okay. Drew is asking about the phishing email test. He says, how do you gain access to that? Which license? How does it compare to a service like KnowBe4?
Yeah, so it's I'm familiar with KnowBe4, and that's kind of a similar tool to the phishing tool that's in Office 365 here. I believe the phishing functionality in Exchange Online is available with an E3 license, I think. But again, I don't want to be definitive on any of the licensing stuff. I didn't check up on it. And it can get really complicated, so I might not be 100% right on that, but I believe it is a Exchange Online E3 license for users that you are using the phishing tool with, and it compares pretty well to that KnowBe4 tool. KnowBe4 also includes more kind of user training and pre-prepped videos for you that you can follow up with for your users, whereas the Office 365 tool doesn't include necessarily that same level of user training that's part of KnowBe4, but it's otherwise the basic phishing functionality and recording who's clicking on links and you know who you're fooling, that's pretty similar. I think KnowBe4 just has more training for you involved in it.
All right. Last question comes from Cedric. Is it possible to review exchange forwarding rules?
Yes, it absolutely is possible. Is the short answer to that. You can do there is a PowerShell command you can do fairly quickly that you can see who has mailbox forwarding turned on, and of course there is a PowerShell command that's to disable email forwarding throughout your organization. So yes, that can all be seen and controlled. Those controls are in PowerShell. I don't believe they're in the Exchange GUI, so you may not see them in the web portal for Exchange Online, but it is available through PowerShell.
Excellent. Okay, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. Thanks again, Nathan, for your excellent presentation and answering those questions.
Thank you very much, and everybody have a good day.